The dust swirled across the red plains of Mesa Colony as Jake Morrison stood on his porch watching the twin suns sink toward the horizon. He had lived alone in this cabin for 3 years now, and had grown used to the silence that came with frontier life. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and that was exactly how Jake liked it. His days were spent tending to his small herd of cattle, maintaining the solar panels that powered his home, and fixing whatever broke down in this harsh desert world. At 32 years old, Jake had accepted that he would probably live out his days alone on this dusty rock, and he was fine with that. The sound of engines made him turn his head. 2 transport vehicles were approaching his homestead, kicking up trails of red dust behind them. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the plasma rifle leaning against the doorframe. Visitors were rare out here, and unexpected ones even more so. As the vehicles pulled up to his cabin, Jake saw the markings on their sides and relaxed slightly. These were official transports from the Colonial Council. 4 people stepped out of the vehicles. 3 of them wore the standard uniforms of council representatives, but the 4th was different. He was an older man dressed in traditional clothing that Jake recognized from history files. Apache. The man's face was weathered and dignified, his long gray hair pulled back in a single braid. Jake had heard that the Apache people had settled on a world called New Apache several generations ago, but he had never met any of them in person. The council representative, a woman named Helen Carter, approached first. She carried a data pad and wore an expression that suggested this visit was as uncomfortable for her as it was surprising for Jake. She greeted him formally and asked if they could speak inside. Jake nodded and led them into his cabin, suddenly very aware of how small and cluttered the space was. Helen wasted no time getting to the point. She explained that Jake's great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, had made an agreement with the Apache Nation over 150 years ago. Back then, when the first colony ships were leaving Earth, the Morrison family had been given crucial supplies and support by the Apache people. In return, Samuel Morrison had signed a treaty promising that his descendants would honor a union between the 2 peoples when the time came. That time, Helen explained, had now arrived. Jake stared at her in disbelief. He had never heard of any such treaty. Helen showed him the documents on her data pad, all properly filed and legally binding. The Apache elder, who introduced himself as Chief Daniel Whitehorse, spoke next. His voice was deep and calm. He explained that his people took such agreements very seriously. Honor and keeping one's word were the foundations of Apache culture. His daughter, Kaya Whitehorse, was of marrying age, and the council had determined that Jake was the closest living descendant of Samuel Morrison, who was unmarried and of appropriate age. Jake felt his world tilting. Marriage. To a woman he had never met, because of a promise made by a man who died long before Jake was even born. He wanted to refuse to tell them this was insane, but Chief Whitehorse's steady gaze made him pause. The old man explained that this was not just about honoring the past. The Apache Nation and the frontier colonies needed to strengthen their bonds. There were raiders and pirates operating in this sector, and unity between their peoples would benefit everyone. Helen added that Jake could refuse if he truly wished to, but doing so would mean breaking a legal treaty. The consequences would include losing his land rights on Mesa Colony and possibly facing legal action from the Colonial Council. Jake felt trapped. This homestead was all he had. 3 years of back-breaking work had gone into building this place. He couldn't just walk away from it. He asked what would happen if he agreed. Chief Whitehorse explained that Kaya would come to live with him here on Mesa Colony. She would be his wife in all legal and traditional senses. The marriage would create a formal bond between the Morrison line and the Whitehorse family, fulfilling the old treaty. In return, Jake would have the full support and protection of the Apache Nation. Given the increasing raider activity in the sector, that protection was not insignificant. Jake asked for time to think, but Helen shook her head. The decision needed to be made now. Chief Whitehorse and his delegation had traveled a long way, and Kaya was waiting at the colonial settlement 20 miles south. If Jake agreed, she would arrive tomorrow. If he refused, the council would begin processing the legal paperwork to reclaim his land. Jake looked around his small cabin. He thought about his life here, the isolation he had chosen, the simple existence he had carved out. Then he thought about losing it all because of a promise made generations ago. He felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced it down. Getting angry wouldn't change the situation. He was a practical man, and practically speaking, he didn't have much choice. He agreed. Chief Whitehorse nodded with approval. Helen looked relieved. They provided Jake with information about Kaya, though it was basic. She was 28 years old, trained as a warrior in Apache tradition, and had volunteered for this arrangement to honor her father and her people. The old chief stood and shook Jake's hand, his grip firm and steady. He told Jake that Kaya was a woman of great strength and honor, and that Jake should treat her with respect. After they left, Jake sat alone in his cabin as darkness fell. He tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. He had seen pictures of Apache people in historical databases. They looked like any other humans, though their culture and traditions were distinctly their own. He wondered what Kaya would be like, whether they would be able to make this strange arrangement work. Jake spent the evening cleaning his cabin more thoroughly than he had in months. He fixed the broken chair at his table, patched a leak in the roof, and even attempted to organize the clutter that had accumulated in the corners. It felt absurd, preparing for a wife he had never met, but he didn't know what else to do. That night, Jake lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow his life would change completely. A stranger would walk through his door and become his wife because of a promise made long before either of them was born. He wondered if she resented this arrangement as much as he did. He wondered if they would even be able to talk to each other, or if they would spend their lives as awkward strangers sharing a too-small cabin. Sleep came slowly that night. When it finally did, Jake dreamed of dust storms and shadows that moved like giants across the red desert plains. Jake woke before dawn and found himself unable to go back to sleep. He made coffee and sat on his porch watching the darkness slowly give way to the dim red light of early morning. His mind kept racing through everything that would happen today. A wife. He was getting a wife. The whole concept still felt unreal. He spent the morning doing his regular chores, trying to keep himself busy and distracted. He fed the cattle, checked the water recycling system, and inspected the perimeter fence. Every few minutes he would glance toward the road, looking for approaching vehicles. The waiting was worse than anything else. Around midday, he finally saw the dust trail. A single transport vehicle was approaching from the south. Jake's heart started beating faster. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and stood up straighter, trying to compose himself. He had no idea what to say or how to act. Should he greet her formally? Should he shake her hand? The Colonial Council had provided no guidance on the etiquette of meeting an arranged bride. The vehicle stopped in front of his cabin. The driver stayed inside, but the passenger door opened. Jake took a breath and stepped forward to offer a polite greeting. Then he stopped moving entirely. The woman who emerged from the vehicle had to duck low to clear the doorframe. When she straightened up to her full height, Jake felt his mouth go dry. She was massive. Not fat, not bulky, but tall and powerfully built in a way he had never seen before. She stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Her shoulders were broad, her arms thick with muscle, her entire frame suggesting immense strength. Kaya Whitehorse looked down at Jake with dark eyes that were both curious and cautious. Her black hair was braided in a long plait that hung down her back. She wore simple clothing, pants and a shirt that seemed more functional than decorative. But even in basic clothes, her presence was overwhelming. Her face was striking, with high cheekbones and strong features that might have been beautiful if Jake could get past his shock at her sheer size. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Jake realized he was staring and tried to stop, but he couldn't help it. Kaya looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was that disappointment? Resignation? She shifted her weight, and Jake noticed how careful her movements were, as if she was trying not to seem threatening. Finally, Kaya spoke. Her voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily across the space between them. She said that she was Kaya Whitehorse and that she understood he was Jake Morrison. Her words were formal, almost stiff. She asked if he was ready to proceed with the arrangement as agreed. Jake managed to nod and found his voice. He said yes, though it came out more uncertain than he intended. He gestured toward the cabin and invited her inside, then immediately realized the problem. His doorway was standard height, maybe 6.5 feet at most. Kaya would have to bend significantly to enter. She did so without comment, ducking her head and shoulders to fit through the frame. Inside the cabin, things got worse. The ceiling was only 7 feet high, meaning Kaya had to keep her head slightly bowed. She looked around the small space and Jake saw her expression tighten. Everything here was built for someone his size, not hers. The furniture, the doorways, even the bed would be far too small for her. Jake felt embarrassment wash over him. He hadn't thought about this. The information the council gave him said nothing about her height. He stammered an apology, saying he didn't know and that he would fix things as best he could. Kaya held up a hand to stop him. She said it was not his fault and that she would manage. Her tone suggested she had dealt with such problems before. She moved carefully to the table and looked at the chairs. Jake could see they would never support her weight. She settled for leaning against the wall instead, her head still slightly bent to avoid the ceiling. The silence stretched between them again, awkward and heavy. Jake tried to think of something to say. He asked if she wanted water or food. Kaya declined politely. He asked about her journey from New Apache. She gave short answers, describing the trip in basic terms. Her responses were courteous but distant, offering no real opening for conversation. Finally, Kaya addressed what they were both thinking. She said that she understood this arrangement was not what Jake had wanted. It was not what she had wanted either. But her father's word was sacred to her, and she would fulfill her duty as his wife. However, she expected respect in return. She would not be treated as a servant or a burden. If they were to make this work, they needed to treat each other as equals. Jake felt a flash of irritation at her tone. He told her he had no intention of treating her badly and that he understood duty just as well as she did. He had given up his peaceful life for this, too. Kaya's eyes narrowed slightly, and Jake realized he had sounded more defensive than he meant to. She asked him directly what he saw when he looked at her. Jake hesitated, unsure how to answer truthfully without causing offense. Kaya's expression hardened. She said she knew what he saw. A giant, a freak, someone too large, too strong, too different. She had seen that look before on the faces of baseline humans. Jake wanted to deny it, but he couldn't entirely. She was right. Her size had shocked him. It still shocked him, but he forced himself to look past the initial reaction and really see her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself carefully as if afraid to break something. He saw the resignation in her eyes, the expectation of rejection or fear. He told her the truth. He said yes, her height had surprised him because no one had warned him. But he had agreed to this marriage, and he would honor that agreement. He asked what her people would think if they saw him. A short, ordinary man who probably looked weak compared to Apache standards. They were both out of their element here. Something in Kaya's expression shifted slightly. Not quite approval, but perhaps a small amount of understanding. She acknowledged that he was right. Her people were all large and powerful due to generations of living on a high-gravity world. To them, baseline humans seemed fragile and small, but she had been taught not to judge others by their appearance. Jake suggested they start over. He introduced himself properly, stating his full name and offering his hand. Kaya looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then carefully took it in her own. Her hand was huge, completely engulfing his, and her grip was controlled and gentle despite the obvious strength behind it. They shook once, formally. Kaya set down the single bag she had brought with her. Jake showed her around the small cabin, pointing out where things were and how the systems worked. She listened attentively, asking practical questions about water rationing and power management. They discussed sleeping arrangements, and Jake offered to take the floor while she used the bed. Kaya refused, saying the bed would break under her weight anyway. She would make do with blankets on the floor. As the day wore on, they settled into a careful politeness. Jake made dinner, simple protein rations and vegetables from his small garden. They ate in silence, Kaya sitting cross-legged on the floor since it gave her more headroom than trying to use a chair. Jake found himself stealing glances at her, still trying to process her presence. That night they lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the small cabin. Jake on his bed, Kaya on a pile of blankets on the floor. Neither spoke, but both were clearly awake. Jake thought about how strange his life had become in just 24 hours. Yesterday he had been alone. Tonight there was a 8-foot-tall warrior woman sleeping in his cabin, bound to him by ancient promises and legal contracts. He wondered what would happen next. How would they live together? Could they ever be more than reluctant strangers sharing a space? He had so many questions and no answers. Beside him in the darkness, Kaya lay awake with her own thoughts, equally uncertain about the future that stretched before them. The first week passed in a series of small disasters and uncomfortable adjustments. Kaya broke the remaining good chair on the second day when she forgot and sat down too quickly. The wooden frame splintered under her weight with a loud crack that made them both freeze. She apologized stiffly and Jake waved it off. But the incident set the tone for everything that followed. The cabin seemed to shrink with two people in it, especially when one of those people had to constantly duck and bend to move around. Kaya spent most of her time outside during the day, which Jake suspected was as much to give herself space to stand upright as it was to be helpful. She took on the outdoor work without being asked, hauling water containers that Jake normally needed the mechanical dolly to move. She lifted them as easily as he might lift a cup of coffee. Jake watched her work from the porch, feeling useless and oddly inadequate. Tasks that took him hours to complete she finished in minutes. When the fence line needed repair, she simply picked up the posts and drove them into the hard ground with her bare hands. When one of the cattle got stuck in a ravine, she climbed down and carried the full-grown animal back up as if it weighed nothing. He tried to find ways to contribute that matched her efforts. He focused on the technical work, the repairs to the solar panels and water recyclers that required precision rather than strength. He maintained the communication equipment and updated the security systems. But even as he worked, he felt the strange imbalance between them. She was so clearly more capable in so many ways. They spoke little during those first days. Conversations were brief and practical, limited to necessities. Kaya would ask where tools were kept or how he wanted something done. Jake would explain the systems and routines of the homestead. Beyond that, silence filled the space between them. They were like two strangers forced to share a too small room, carefully avoiding each other while being constantly aware of the other's presence. At night, the awkwardness intensified. The cabin had no separate rooms, just the single main space. They had established a routine where Jake would change in the storage corner while Kaya looked away, and then she would do the same while he faced the wall. They lay on opposite sides of the cabin, the darkness heavy with things unsaid. Sometimes Jake would hear Kaya shift position, the sound of her breathing deep and steady. He wondered what she thought about in those quiet hours. On the 8th day, something changed. Jake was working on the water recycler when it suddenly malfunctioned, spraying him with cold recycled water. He cursed and jumped back, soaked through. Kaya came running at the sound of his shout, ducking through the doorway with concern on her face. When she saw him standing there dripping wet, looking annoyed but unhurt, something unexpected happened. She laughed. It was a deep, warm sound that filled the cabin. Jake stared at her, surprised, and then found himself smiling despite being cold and wet. He made some comment about the recycler finally deciding to fight back, and Kaya's laughter continued. The tension that had been present since her arrival seemed to crack slightly. After that, things became marginally easier. They began to exchange small observations about their day. Kaya mentioned that the cattle seemed to like her, following her around when she worked near their pen. Jake explained that they probably thought she was some kind of walking shade tree and just wanted to get out of the sun. Kaya smiled at that, a rare expression that softened her usually serious face. Jake started asking her about New Apache, curious about the world that had produced such dramatically different humans. Kaya described the crushing gravity, 3 times that of Earth standard. She explained how her people had adapted over generations, growing larger and stronger to survive. Children on New Apache learned to walk later than baseline human children, because the gravity made everything so much harder. By the time they reached adulthood, Apache people were incredibly powerful, but they could never comfortably visit lower gravity worlds. The weakness they felt in standard gravity was disorienting. Jake asked if she felt weak here on Mesa Colony. Kaya considered the question and said yes and no. The lower gravity made her feel light, almost like she might float away. But it also meant she had to be constantly careful. Her strength, which was normal on New Apache, was dangerous here. She could easily hurt someone without meaning to. Even something as simple as shaking hands required thought and control. He began to understand some of her careful movements, the way she touched things so gently despite her size. She was like a person made of iron trying to live in a world of glass. One moment of forgetting, one instant of moving naturally, and she could cause serious damage. In return, Jake told her about his life before Mesa Colony. He had been a technician on a colony ship, traveling between worlds to repair and maintain equipment. The work was steady but lonely, and he had grown tired of never staying in one place. When the opportunity came to claim land on Mesa Colony, he had taken it, wanting to build something permanent. The homestead represented 3 years of his life, every improvement made with his own hands. Kaya asked why he had never married before. Jake shrugged and said he had never found the right person. His work kept him moving, and most people wanted stability. By the time he settled down, he had gotten used to being alone. He turned the question back on her and asked the same thing. Kaya's expression became distant. She said that Apache women who trained as warriors rarely married young. The training was demanding and took years to complete. By the time she had earned her status, most men her age were already bonded. Beyond that, she admitted quietly, her size intimidated many Apache men. Even in a society of large, strong people, she was considered unusually tall. Some men found that threatening. Jake looked at her, this powerful woman who could probably break him in half without effort, and saw the loneliness in her eyes. He realized they had more in common than he had initially thought. Both of them had been alone. Both had resigned themselves to that loneliness. This strange arranged marriage had disrupted their isolated lives, throwing them together whether they wanted it or not. He found himself paying more attention to small details. The way Kaya always made sure the cabin was tidy, carefully organizing things after she used them. The way she would sit outside in the evenings and watch the sunset with an expression of quiet longing. The way she hummed sometimes while she worked, songs in a language he didn't understand but found oddly soothing. One afternoon, Jake came back from checking the northern fence line and found Kaya attempting to cook dinner. She had watched him prepare meals and decided to try it herself. The result was enthusiastic but chaotic. She had used too much heat and not enough water, creating something that was half burned and half raw. When Jake entered and saw the mess, Kaya looked embarrassed. She admitted that cooking was not one of her skills. On New Apache, food preparation was communal, and as a warrior in training, she had always eaten in group halls. Jake looked at the disaster on the heating unit and then at her disappointed face. He suggested they cook together and he would teach her. Kaya's expression brightened, and they spent the next hour salvaging dinner and laughing at her mistakes. That night, after they had eaten and cleaned up, they sat outside together for the first time. The twin moons of Mesa Colony were rising, painting the desert silver and red. Kaya sat on the ground, which put her at roughly the same height as Jake sitting on the porch step. They talked about nothing important, just observations about the weather and the landscape. Jake realized that Kaya's presence no longer felt quite so strange. He was getting used to her height, her strength, her careful way of moving through his small world. She was still a giant, still vastly different from him, but she was also just a person trying to make the best of an unexpected situation, just like him. When they finally went inside to sleep, the silence felt less heavy than before. It was not quite comfortable yet, but it was no longer hostile. They were finding a way to exist together, step by awkward step. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Jake woke in the middle of the night to the sound of engines. He sat up immediately, his mind going from sleep to alert in seconds. The sound was wrong. Multiple vehicles moving fast, approaching from the east. No one had any reason to visit his homestead in the middle of the night. Kaya was already awake, her warrior training making her sensitive to any unusual sounds. She moved to the window, looking out into the darkness. Jake grabbed his plasma rifle from its place by his bed and checked the charge. Full. He moved to join Kaya at the window, and together they watched as 3 rough-looking vehicles pulled up outside the cabin. Raiders. Jake had heard about them but never encountered them personally. They operated on the fringes of colonial space, hitting isolated homesteads for supplies and anything valuable they could carry. They were usually well armed and had no hesitation about killing anyone who resisted. 8 men climbed out of the vehicles. Jake could see weapons in their hands, and their body language was aggressive and confident. They expected an easy target, a lone colonist who would either surrender or die quickly. They had no idea what waited for them inside the cabin. The leader, a scarred man with metal implants visible on his arms, shouted toward the cabin. He demanded that Jake come out and surrender all supplies, weapons, and valuables. If Jake cooperated, they would leave him alive. If he resisted, they would take what they wanted anyway and burn the cabin with him inside. Jake looked at Kaya. She met his eyes and gave a small nod. She was ready to fight. Jake moved to the door and shouted back that the raiders should leave now while they still could. His warning was met with laughter. The leader told his men to breach the cabin. 2 raiders approached the door while the others provided cover. Jake waited until they were close, then kicked the door open and fired. His first shot took down one of the approaching men. The second dove for cover, shouting warnings to the others. The element of surprise was gone now, but Jake had bought them a few seconds. Kaya moved. She went through the doorway so fast that Jake barely registered her movement. One moment she was beside him, the next she was outside, covering the distance to the nearest raider in 3 massive strides. The man raised his weapon to fire, but Kaya was already on him. She grabbed the plasma rifle and bent the barrel with her bare hands as if it were made of plastic. The raider stared in shock for a second before Kaya's other hand caught him by the front of his vest and threw him backward into one of his companions. The other raiders opened fire. Energy bolts lit up the night, but Kaya was moving too fast. She used one of the vehicles for cover, then emerged to grab another raider. This one she simply picked up and hurled through the air. He landed hard 10 feet away and didn't get up. Jake provided covering fire from the doorway, his shots forcing the raiders to divide their attention. One tried to flank around the cabin, but Jake caught him in the open and put him down with a precise shot. The man's companions were starting to realize this was not going to be an easy raid. The leader was shouting orders, trying to organize his remaining men. He had 6 people left, including himself, and they were up against just 2 defenders. The numbers should have been in his favor, but nothing was going as planned. He directed 3 men to concentrate fire on the giant woman, while he and the others went for the man in the doorway. Kaya took a hit. An energy bolt caught her in the shoulder, burning through her shirt and searing her flesh. She grunted in pain but didn't slow down. Instead, she charged directly at the 3 men firing at her. They scattered in panic, but she caught one of them, disarming him with a quick twist that probably broke his wrist. She used his body as a shield for a moment, then tossed him aside and went after the next. Jake saw the leader and 2 others trying to circle around to his position. He dropped back inside the cabin, letting them come to him. As they approached the doorway, he fired through the window, catching one in the leg. The man went down screaming. The leader and his remaining companion hesitated, suddenly realizing they had lost the advantage. Outside, Kaya had disabled 2 more raiders. They lay on the ground groaning, their weapons scattered and useless. She turned to face the leader and his last man, blood running down her arm from her wounded shoulder. Even injured, she was terrifying. She stood in the moonlight like some ancient warrior goddess, powerful and unstoppable. The leader made a choice. He grabbed his wounded companion and ran for the vehicles. His one remaining able-bodied man was already there, starting one of the engines. They abandoned their injured comrades and fled into the night, their vehicles kicking up dust as they raced away. The sudden silence after the battle was jarring. Jake stepped out of the cabin, his rifle still raised, scanning for any remaining threats. Kaya stood among the fallen raiders, breathing hard, her hand pressed to her wounded shoulder. The raiders who were still conscious were in no condition to fight, nursing broken bones and various injuries. Jake quickly secured the disabled raiders, using emergency restraints from his supply kit. He would call the colonial security in the morning to collect them. Then he turned his attention to Kaya. The wound on her shoulder was serious, the energy bolt had burned deep. She tried to wave him off, saying it was nothing, but Jake insisted. Inside the cabin, under the light, the wound looked worse. Jake had basic medical training, and he got out his emergency supplies. As he cleaned and treated the burn, he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from anger. These raiders had come to his home, threatened his life, and hurt Kaya. The rage he felt surprised him with its intensity. Kaya watched him work, her expression unreadable. When he had finished bandaging her shoulder, she spoke quietly. She thanked him for having her back during the fight. They had worked well together, she said. Jake met her eyes and told her she had been incredible. He had never seen anyone fight like that. Without her, he would probably be dead. Kaya's expression softened. She said that protecting each other was what partners did. The word hung in the air between them. Partners. Not just a forced arrangement or an obligation, but something more. They had defended their home together, fought side by side, trusted each other in a life or death situation. Jake realized something had shifted during the battle. When he saw Kaya take that hit, When he saw the energy bolt burn into her shoulder, his first reaction had not been fear for himself. It had been fear for her, anger that someone had hurt her, the need to protect her even though she was far more capable of protecting herself than he would ever be. They stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch in case the raiders returned with reinforcements. They sat together, Jake with his rifle and Kaya with her wounded shoulder bound, talking quietly about the fight and what would come next. As the suns began to rise, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, Jake found himself studying Kaya's profile in the growing light. She had come into his life as a stranger, an obligation he had to accept. But tonight she had bled defending their home. Their home. When had he started thinking of it that way? The cabin was no longer just his solitary refuge. It was theirs, something they had fought for together. Kaya turned and caught him looking at her. For a moment, they just held each other's gaze. Something passed between them, unspoken but understood. They were not strangers anymore. The battle had burned away some of the awkwardness and distance. What remained was the beginning of something real, something neither of them had quite expected. When the colonial security finally arrived to collect the captured raiders, the officers were amazed at the scene. 8 armed men had attacked and only 2 defenders had driven them off. The security chief, a gruff man named Frank, looked at Kaya with new respect. He had heard stories about Apache warriors but had never seen one in action. After everyone had left and the homestead was quiet again, Jake and Kaya finally allowed themselves to rest. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them exhausted. Kaya lay down on her blankets, wincing as her shoulder protested. Jake wanted to say something to acknowledge what had happened between them, but he did not have the words yet. Instead, he simply made sure she was comfortable and let her sleep. There would be time for words later. For now, they had survived together, and that was enough. The days following the raid brought changes that neither Jake nor Kaya openly discussed, but both clearly felt. The fight had stripped away pretense and forced them to rely on each other completely. Trust, which had been slowly building, now had a solid foundation. They had faced death together and survived. And that shared experience created a bond stronger than any treaty or arrangement. Jake found himself checking on Kaya's shoulder throughout the day, making sure the wound was healing properly. She tolerated his fussing with patient amusement, occasionally reminding him that Apache healing was faster than baseline human recovery. Within a week, the burn had faded to a pale scar, barely visible against her skin. Still, Jake noticed she favored that arm slightly when she thought he was not watching. They fell into new rhythms. Kaya began asking Jake to teach her more about the technical systems that kept the homestead running. She sat beside him, her large frame folded carefully into a position that allowed her to see what he was doing, as he explained how the water recycler worked, or how to calibrate the solar panels. She learned quickly, her questions intelligent and practical. In return, Jake asked her to teach him about Apache combat techniques. He knew he would never have her strength or speed, but he wanted to understand her methods. Kaya agreed, and their training sessions became a daily routine. She taught him how to read an opponent's body language, how to move efficiently, how to use his smaller size as an advantage rather than a limitation. When she demonstrated holds and techniques, she was incredibly gentle, always conscious of her superior strength. During one session, Jake managed to slip past her guard using a move she had taught him. Kaya's eyes lit up with genuine pleasure and she praised his progress. The approval in her voice made Jake feel absurdly proud. He realized he cared what she thought of him, wanted to impress her, wanted to see that smile more often. They started cooking together every evening. What had begun as Jake teaching Kaya the basics had evolved into a partnership. She handled the physical tasks, cutting and preparing ingredients with surprising delicacy given her size. He managed the heating and timing, the technical aspects of the process. Their meals improved dramatically, and the time spent working side by side became one of Jake's favorite parts of the day. Conversations flowed more easily now. Kaya told him stories about her childhood on New Apache, describing a world so different from anything Jake had experienced. She spoke of learning to hunt in the high mountains where the gravity was even more crushing, of the ceremonial dances her people performed to honor their ancestors, of the complex honor codes that governed Apache society. Her voice became animated when she talked about her younger sister, Maya, who had chosen to become a teacher rather than a warrior. Jake shared his own memories, talking about growing up on a crowded station orbiting Jupiter, where every cubic meter of space was precious and privacy was a luxury. He described the wonder he had felt the first time he set foot on an actual planet, how strange it was to look up and see sky instead of metal bulkheads. He told her about his parents, both dead now, and how they had encouraged his love of fixing broken things. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Kaya asked Jake what he had thought when he first saw her. He considered lying, giving some polite answer, but decided honesty would serve them better. He admitted that her size had shocked him, even frightened him a little. She was so far outside his frame of reference that his brain had not known how to process her presence. Kaya nodded slowly, unsurprised. She asked if he still felt that way. Jake looked at her, really looked at her. The setting suns painted her skin in warm light, and her expression was open and vulnerable in a way he rarely saw. He realized that somewhere along the way his perception had shifted completely. He no longer saw a giant or a strange being. He saw Kaya, a woman who was strong and brave and kind, who hummed while she worked and laughed at his terrible jokes and made him feel less alone. He told her the truth. He said that now when he looked at her, he just saw someone he was beginning to care about quite a lot. The words came out more intensely than he had intended, revealing more than he was quite ready to admit. Kaya's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. Then very quietly she said she felt the same way. The air between them seemed to change, charged with possibility. Jake wanted to reach for her hand, but felt suddenly uncertain. Everything was moving so fast, emotions he had not expected to feel were rising up and demanding attention. Kaya seemed equally unsure, her usual confidence faltering in the face of something neither of them had planned for. The moment passed when one of the cattle bellowed in the distance, breaking the spell. They both laughed, the tension easing slightly. But something had been acknowledged, and there was no taking it back. They cared for each other. This arrangement, forced on them by ancient promises and political necessity, had somehow become real. The next day brought a practical problem that highlighted their growing partnership. The water recycler, which had been temperamental for weeks, finally gave up completely. Jake diagnosed the issue quickly. A critical component had burned out and needed to be replaced. Unfortunately, the replacement part was buried in his storage shed, which had become cluttered and disorganized over the years. The storage shed was too small for Kaya to easily enter, but moving everything by himself would take Jake hours. Kaya suggested a solution. He would go inside and locate the part, handing items out to her. She would organize everything outside, making the shed more efficient in the process. Working together, they could finish the job quickly. It worked perfectly. Jake rummaged through boxes and equipment, calling out what he found. Kaya took each item, asking where it should go, and created organized stacks based on his instructions. They fell into an easy rhythm, their coordination smooth and natural. At one point, Jake emerged from the shed covered in dust and cobwebs, and Kaya laughed so hard she had to sit down. He tried to look offended, but ended up laughing with her. They found the part and got the recycler working again. Standing back to admire their success, covered in dust and sweat but satisfied, Jake felt a surge of contentment. This was what partnership meant. Not grand gestures or romantic declarations, but working together to solve problems, each contributing what they could, supporting each other's weaknesses with their strengths. That night, after cleaning up and eating dinner, they lingered outside longer than usual. The conversation wandered from topic to topic, neither of them wanting the evening to end. At some point, Kaya began telling Jake about Apache bonding ceremonies, how couples on New Apache formalized their relationships through rituals that tested their compatibility and commitment. Jake listened, fascinated. He asked if she wished they had done something like that, instead of the quick legal ceremony the Colonial Council had arranged. Kaya considered the question. She said that while the traditional ceremonies were meaningful, what mattered most was not how a bond began, but how it developed. Some couples who went through elaborate rituals ended up unhappy, while others who started with simple agreements found deep connection. She turned to Jake and said that she had not expected to find anything real in this arrangement. She had agreed to honor her father's word, expecting at best a cordial partnership and at worst a miserable obligation. But somehow, against all probability, she had found someone she actually wanted to be with, someone who saw past her size and strength to the person underneath. someone who made her laugh and challenged her to learn new things and defended their home at her side without hesitation. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He told her that he had spent 3 years alone on this homestead, convinced that solitude was his fate. He had accepted it, even embraced it. Then she had walked through his door and everything had changed. At first he had resented the intrusion, the forced nature of their bond. But now he could not imagine going back to life without her. The cabin would feel empty, the days would lose their color, and he would be diminished by her absence. They looked at each other in the moonlight, and slowly, carefully, Jake reached for Kaya's hand. His hand looked tiny in hers, but she held it gently, mindful of her strength. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just being together. The silence was comfortable now, full of understanding rather than awkwardness. When they finally went inside to sleep, something had fundamentally changed. They were not strangers anymore, not just partners making the best of a bad situation. They were becoming something more, something neither of them had quite found the words for yet, but both of them felt it, and that was enough. The growing season arrived with its own challenges and opportunities. Jake had planned to expand his small garden, but the work would be intensive. Kaya volunteered to help, and together they transformed a barren patch of ground into productive farmland. She handled the heavy digging and hauling, breaking up soil that would have taken Jake weeks to prepare. He focused on the precise work of planning irrigation channels and selecting crops that would thrive in Mesa Colony's harsh climate. Working together under the hot suns, they developed an easy companionship that felt natural and right. Kaya would pause in her digging to wipe sweat from her forehead, and Jake would hand her water without being asked. He would struggle with a stubborn rock, and she would move it aside with one hand while continuing to work with the other. They communicated as much through gestures and glances as through words, developing the kind of understanding that usually took years to build. One afternoon, as they took a break in the shade of the cabin, Kaya asked Jake about the settlement's annual gathering. She had heard him mention it in passing and was curious about what it entailed. Jake explained that once a year, all the homesteaders in their sector came together for a festival of sorts. People traded goods, shared news, and enjoyed rare social contact. It was one of the few times the isolated colonists could gather as a community. Kaya asked if he planned to attend. Jake hesitated, suddenly uncertain. He wanted to go, but the thought of bringing Kaya made him anxious. The other colonists were not bad people, but they were provincial and often narrow-minded. He had heard enough casual prejudice against the Apache to know that Kaya's appearance would cause a stir. He worried about the stares, the comments, the potential confrontations. Kaya read his hesitation accurately. She told him she understood if he preferred to go alone, that she would not take offense. But something in her tone suggested she would in fact be hurt by such a choice. Jake made a decision. He told her they would go together, and anyone who had a problem with that could deal with him. The gathering was held at the settlement's central square, a cleared area with temporary shelters set up for trading and socializing. When Jake and Kaya arrived, the reactions were immediate and varied. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to stare. Children pointed until their parents hushed them. Some colonists looked curious, others wary, a few openly hostile. Jake stood close to Kaya, not quite touching but clearly positioned as her partner. Kaya, for her part, held her head high and walked with quiet dignity. If the stares bothered her, she gave no sign. They made their way to the trading area, where Jake had promised to exchange some of his surplus equipment for supplies they needed. Most of the colonists were polite, if distant. They addressed Jake and nodded to Kaya without comment. A few were genuinely friendly, introducing themselves and welcoming Kaya to the community. One older woman, a farmer named Betty, actually hugged Kaya and told her it was nice to see another strong woman in these parts. Then there was Pete Collins. He was a loud, aggressive man who ran one of the larger homesteads and seemed to think that gave him authority over others. He had been drinking, and when he saw Jake and Kaya, his face twisted into an ugly smirk. He called out loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear, asking Jake if he had decided to collect exotic animals as well as cattle. The crowd went silent. Jake felt rage rise in his chest, hot and fierce. He started to move toward Pete, ready to fight despite knowing he would probably lose, but Kaya's hand on his shoulder stopped him. She looked down at him and gave a small shake of her head. Then she turned to face Pete directly. She asked him calmly if he was challenging her. Pete, emboldened by alcohol in his audience, said he was just making an observation. Kaya suggested that instead of observations, they settle things in a more traditional manner. She challenged him to an arm wrestling match. If Pete won, she would apologize for taking offense. If she won, he would apologize for the insult. Pete looked around at the gathered crowd and found himself trapped by his own bravado. He could not back down without looking like a coward. He agreed, and they moved to one of the tables. Pete sat down, his face confident. Kaya carefully positioned herself, kneeling beside the table since the chairs would not support her weight. This position actually gave Pete a height advantage, which he seemed to think was a good sign. They gripped hands, Pete's meaty fist engulfed by Kaya's larger one. Someone counted down and the match began. Pete strained immediately, his face reddening with effort. Kaya held steady, not moving an inch. She was not even visibly struggling. She held him there for several seconds, letting him exhaust himself, and then slowly, inexorably pushed his arm down to the table. The match was over in less than a minute. Pete sat there breathing hard, his pride shattered. The crowd watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Kaya released his hand and stood. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, she offered her other hand to help Pete up. She told him quietly that strength came in many forms, and judging others by appearance alone was a mistake. Pete looked up at her, his expression a mixture of humiliation and grudging respect. He took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. Then, with obvious reluctance, he apologized for his comment. Kaya accepted the apology with grace and even bought him a drink, turning what could have been an ongoing conflict into a closed matter. The rest of the gathering went much better. People who had been standoffish approached to talk with Kaya, asking about New Apache and her life there. Several homesteaders asked if she would be willing to help with heavy work in exchange for supplies or services. She agreed to some requests, establishing herself as a valued member of the community rather than an outsider. Jake watched it all with growing pride. Kaya had handled Pete's hostility perfectly, showing strength without cruelty and winning respect through both power and restraint. She had taken a potentially terrible situation and turned it into an opportunity to prove herself. He found himself marveling at her social intelligence, something he had not fully appreciated before. On the journey home that evening, they talked about the day. Kaya admitted she had been nervous about attending, worried that she would embarrass Jake or cause problems. Jake told her honestly that she had been incredible. The way she handled Pete, the way she engaged with the other colonists, the dignity and confidence she showed throughout, all of it had made him proud to be seen with her. Kaya looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. She said that his support had meant everything to her, standing beside her, defending her, making it clear that they were together. That had given her the courage to face the stares and judgments. She had not felt alone, and that made all the difference. They reached the cabin as the suns were setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Jake and Kaya stood on the porch for a moment, neither wanting to go inside quite yet. The day had been significant in ways that went beyond the surface events. They had presented themselves as a unit to the community, and in doing so had made their bond more real. Jake turned to Kaya, his heart pounding. He told her that he needed to say something, that he could not keep it inside anymore. He said that what had started as an obligation, a duty forced on them by ancient promises, had become the most important thing in his life. He cared about her, not because he had to, but because she was remarkable. Strong and kind, fierce and gentle, powerful and vulnerable. He loved her, all of her, and he needed her to know that. Kaya stood very still, her eyes wide. For a long moment she said nothing, and Jake felt panic rising. Had he misread everything? Had he pushed too far, too fast? Then Kaya's face broke into a smile, genuine and radiant, and she told him she had been afraid to hope, afraid that he could never truly want someone like her, so different from his own kind. But she loved him too. Loved his strength of character, his gentle hands and sharp mind, his courage and his kindness. She loved him completely, and hearing him say those words felt like coming home. They stood there in the fading light, looking at each other with new understanding. This was not the arrangement anymore. This was not duty or obligation. This was love, real and true, growing between two people who had not expected to find it. They had been forced together by circumstance, but what they had built together was entirely their own choice. Jake reached up and Kaya bent down, and they kissed for the first time. It was awkward because of the height difference, and they laughed against each other's lips, but it was also perfect. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. The future stretched before them, uncertain and full of challenges. But they would face it together. Partners in every sense of the word, bound by something far stronger than ancient treaties. They had found love in the last place either of them expected, and that made it all the more precious. 2 months of happiness passed like a dream. Jake and Kaya settled into their life together with increasing ease, their love growing stronger with each passing day. They expanded the homestead, built a larger shelter with high ceilings for Kaya's comfort, and became known in the settlement as a formidable team. Other colonists sought Kaya's help with heavy work, and Jake's technical skills were in constant demand. They were building something real and lasting, and both of them felt more content than they had ever been. Then the message came. It arrived on a secure channel directly from New Apache, and the moment Kaya saw the sender's identification, her face went pale. She opened the communication with shaking hands, and Jake stood beside her, sensing that whatever news this brought would not be good. Chief Daniel Whitehorse appeared on the screen, but the strong, dignified man Jake remembered from their first meeting was gone. In his place was someone diminished by illness, his face drawn and his movements weak. He greeted his daughter with affection but also with sorrow in his eyes. He told her that his health had declined rapidly over the past weeks. The doctors gave him months at most, and the question of succession had become urgent. Kaya listened with tears running down her face. Her father continued, explaining that her younger brother Marcus was making a bid for leadership. He had gathered supporters among the more traditional Apache factions, those who believed their people should isolate themselves from baseline humanity. Marcus argued that the Apache had evolved beyond their origins and should forge their own path, cutting ties with the weaker humans who had once been their kin. Chief Whitehorse explained that as the eldest child and a proven warrior, Kaya had a legitimate claim to leadership. Many on the council believed she should return to New Apache and challenge Marcus for the position. If she did not, Marcus would likely win by default and his isolationist policies would be implemented. The carefully built bridges between the Apache Nation and the frontier colonies would crumble. But there was a complication. Apache law required that anyone claiming leadership must reside among their people and prove their commitment to the nation. Kaya's marriage to Jake and her life on Mesa Colony had been seen as fulfilling the old treaty, but now it worked against her. If she wanted to lead, she would have to come home. Not for a visit, but permanently. After the call ended, Kaya sat in silence for a long time. Jake wanted to comfort her, but did not know how. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with pain. She explained the full weight of the decision before her. Her people needed her. Her father was dying, and her brother's vision would damage everything the Apache had worked to build. But returning to New Apache would mean leaving Jake, leaving the life they had created together, leaving everything she had found here. Jake's first response was immediate. He told her they would both go. She should not have to choose between duty and love. They would travel to New Apache together, and he would stand beside her through whatever came next. Kaya looked at him with both love and horror. She explained what he was suggesting. New Apache's gravity was 3 times Earth standard. Jake, without the genetic adaptations of her people, would suffer immensely there. She pulled up medical data on her screen, showing him the statistics. Baseline humans who spent time on New Apache experienced constant pain as their bodies struggled against the crushing weight. Heart strained, bones stressed, every movement became exhausting. Most could endure it for only short periods with medical support. Living there permanently would likely shorten Jake's life by decades. She could not ask that of him. Jake listened to all of it and told her his decision remained unchanged. He loved her, and love meant supporting her even when it was hard, even when it cost him something. If her people needed her, if her father was calling for her, then they would go together. He would endure whatever came because the alternative, losing her, was unthinkable. They spent the next days in agonized discussion. Kaya contacted her younger sister Maya through private channels to learn more about the political situation on New Apache. Maya confirmed that Marcus had significant support, particularly among the younger generation who had never known baseline humans personally. They saw the Apache as superior and believed maintaining ties with weaker humans was holding them back. Maya also revealed that she had her own concerns about Marcus's leadership. He was passionate but lacked their father's wisdom and temperance. His policies would not just isolate the Apache, but might lead to conflicts with neighboring systems. The Apache were powerful, but they were not invincible, and making enemies of their former allies would be dangerous. Jake began researching medical treatments that might help him survive on New Apache. There were drugs that could strengthen bones and support cardiovascular function under high gravity. Exoskeletons that could provide mechanical assistance. All of it was expensive and only partially effective, but he was determined to find a way. He contacted doctors, read medical journals, and investigated every possible option. Kaya watched him push himself, saw the determination in his eyes, and felt her heart breaking. He would destroy himself trying to follow her, sacrificing his health and his life because he loved her. But what kind of love was that? How could she be happy watching him suffer every day, knowing that she was the cause of his pain? One evening, a week before the Apache delegation would arrive to take Kaya home, she made a decision. She told Jake she had been thinking about everything and had realized something important. The Apache people did not necessarily need her as their chief. What they needed was someone who could unite them and guide them wisely. Maya had that capability. She was intelligent, diplomatic, and respected by many on the council. With the right support, Maya could be an excellent leader. What the Apache truly needed, Kaya continued, was not another warrior chief, but someone who could build bridges between their people and the rest of humanity. Someone who understood both worlds, who had lived among baseline humans and knew they were not inferior, just different. The arranged marriages like hers were supposed to create understanding, but they had been largely symbolic until now. Kaya proposed a new role for herself, one that did not yet exist but was desperately needed. She would become an official ambassador, traveling between worlds representing both the Apache Nation and the frontier settlements. She would work to strengthen the ties Marcus wanted to break, demonstrating through her own marriage that unity between their peoples was not just possible but valuable. She and Jake could be living proof that differences in strength and size did not matter when there was respect and love. Jake listened carefully, seeing the logic in her proposal, but also sensing her pain. He asked if this was truly what she wanted, or if she was just trying to avoid putting him at risk. Kaya admitted it was both. She did not want to watch him suffer on New Apache, but she also genuinely believed that the ambassador role would serve her people better than a disputed leadership claim. Marcus wanted power. Let him have it and bear the burden of responsibility. She would serve in a different way. They spent the remaining days preparing Kaya's proposal. She contacted Maya and several trusted council members, building support for her alternative plan. The response was mixed. Some saw the wisdom in her proposal, recognizing that having an Apache ambassador who genuinely understood baseline humans would be valuable. Others saw it as a convenient excuse to avoid her duty. When the delegation arrived, Chief Whitehorse himself had made the journey despite his failing health. He wanted to speak with his daughter face-to-face about this crucial decision. Jake offered to give them privacy, but both Kaya and her father asked him to stay. Whatever was decided would affect all of them. Kaya presented her proposal to her father, explaining her reasoning with passion and clarity. She spoke of the value of building understanding, of how her time with Jake had taught her that strength came in many forms. She argued that the Apache needed connection with the wider human community, not isolation. She offered herself as a bridge between worlds, someone who could represent her people's interests while also advocating for cooperation. Chief Whitehorse listened quietly, his weathered face thoughtful. When Kaya finished, he turned to Jake and asked him directly if he would have gone to New Apache despite the cost. Jake met the old chief's eyes and answered truthfully. He said yes, he would have gone because he loved Kaya and would not let her face such a trial alone. Even if it meant suffering, even if it shortened his life, he would have stood beside her. The chief nodded slowly, seeing the truth in Jake's words. He told them both that he had hoped the arranged marriage would create understanding between their peoples, but he had not dared to hope for genuine love. Yet here it was, strong enough that both of them were willing to sacrifice for the other. That kind of bond was rare and precious. He gave his blessing to Kaya's proposal with one condition. She must return to New Apache for 6 months to make her case to the council and the people. She must face Marcus and argue for her alternative vision. Only then, when she had fulfilled her obligation to be heard, could she take on the role of ambassador. Chief Whitehorse also asked that Jake come with her for part of that time, so the Apache people could see what baseline humans were truly like. The journey to New Apache took 3 weeks by transport ship, and Jake spent much of that time undergoing medical treatments to prepare his body for the crushing gravity. The doctors administered drugs to strengthen his bones and heart, fitted him with a support exoskeleton that would help bear some of the weight, and warned him repeatedly about the risks. Even with all the preparations, he would be in constant discomfort at best and serious danger at worst. Kaya watched the treatments with growing anxiety. She questioned daily whether they were making the right choice, whether she should simply send Jake back to Mesa Colony and face her people alone. But Jake refused every time she suggested it. He had promised to stand beside her, and he would keep that promise. Besides, he argued, if the Apache people were going to accept Kaya's vision of cooperation, they needed to see that baseline humans had courage and determination, even if they lacked physical strength. When the ship finally entered New Apache's atmosphere, Jake felt the change immediately. Gravity grabbed at him like a physical hand, pulling him down with crushing force. Standing up became an effort. Walking required concentration and energy, and even breathing felt harder. The exoskeleton helped, but it could only do so much. Every movement was a reminder of how different this world was from anything he had known. Kaya watched him struggle and felt her heart twist. She stayed close, ready to catch him if he fell, her usual confidence shaken by seeing Jake in such obvious difficulty. The other Apache who met them at the landing site stared at Jake with a mixture of curiosity and pity. To them, he looked impossibly fragile, a being made of glass trying to exist in a world of iron. The first few days were the hardest. Jake's body fought against the gravity constantly, his muscles screaming in protest at even simple tasks. He could not walk more than a few hundred meters without needing to rest. Standing for long periods left him exhausted. Kaya wanted to carry him everywhere, but Jake refused. He needed to prove to himself as much as to the Apache that he could endure this. Slowly, painfully, he adapted. His body learned to function under the new conditions, finding ways to move more efficiently. The exoskeleton became like a second skin, its movements synchronized with his own. He would never be comfortable on New Apache, but he found a way to survive. Meanwhile, Kaya was engaged in the political battle for her people's future. She met with council members, spoke at gatherings, and debated with Marcus and his supporters. Her brother was younger than her by 4 years, ambitious and charismatic. He genuinely believed his isolationist vision was best for the Apache, and he argued his case with passion. The debates were public, held in the great council hall where Apache people gathered to witness their future leaders present their visions. Marcus spoke of Apache strength and superiority, of how their evolution had made them greater than the baseline humans who remained weak and fragile. He pointed to Jake, sitting in the audience with his exoskeleton and obvious struggle, as proof that baseline humans could not truly be partners with the Apache. At best, they were ancestors to be respected. At worst, they were reminders of a weaker past the Apache had transcended. When it was Kaya's turn to speak, she addressed Marcus's points directly. She agreed that the Apache had evolved and become powerful, but she questioned his definition of strength. She spoke of Jake, who had traveled to a world that caused him constant pain simply because he refused to let her face challenges alone. She described how he had stood beside her against raiders, how his technical knowledge and quick thinking complemented her physical power. She asked the assembled Apache whether courage in the face of impossible odds was not its own form of strength. She spoke of her time on Mesa Colony, of the community there and how they had accepted her once they looked past their initial fear. She described the possibility of true partnership between Apache and baseline humans, where each brought different strengths to create something greater than either could achieve alone. She argued that isolation would make the Apache strong in the short term, but weak in the long term, cut off from new ideas and different perspectives. The debates continued for weeks. Public opinion shifted back and forth as both sides made compelling arguments. Jake attended every session, Sitting in the audience despite the pain and exhaustion, his presence became a statement in itself, a baseline human who refused to give up even in the most hostile environment imaginable. Chief Whitehorse, though weakened by illness, attended as many sessions as his health allowed. He watched both his children argue their visions for the future, and Jake could see the old man's pride mixed with sadness. Whatever happened, Daniel would not live to see the full outcome of this decision. During the 6th week, something unexpected happened. Maya, Kaya's younger sister, requested permission to address the council. She was not a candidate for leadership, but as a respected educator and the chief's youngest child, she had the right to speak. She stood before the gathered Apache and made her own case. She argued that both her siblings were partially right, but that neither had the complete answer. Marcus was correct that the Apache needed strong leadership and should be proud of their evolution. Kaya was right that isolation would ultimately weaken them. Maya proposed a compromise. Marcus should become chief, as he had the support of the traditionalist factions and the force of personality to unite them. But Kaya should be appointed as the first official Apache ambassador, creating a new position that would serve the nation in a different but equally important way. The proposal caught everyone off guard, including Marcus and Kaya. Maya continued, explaining that the position of ambassador would need to be created by council vote and would have significant authority. The ambassador would represent Apache interests in dealings with other human settlements and governments, but would also work to build understanding and cooperation. It would be a position that required someone who understood both Apache culture and baseline human society intimately. The council debated Maya's proposal intensely. Some saw it as a wise compromise, others as a political maneuver to deny Marcus complete authority, but gradually support built. Many Apache who had been uncomfortable with Marcus's more extreme isolationist rhetoric saw this as a way to have strong internal leadership while maintaining external connections. Those who supported Kaya saw it as a way for her vision to be implemented, even if she did not become chief. Marcus himself, after initial resistance, came to see the value in the proposal. Having Kaya in a separate role meant she would not be a rival to his authority. He could lead the Apache nation while she handled external relations, and their different approaches could serve different needs. He agreed to support the compromise if Kaya would accept it. The vote was held on the 8th week of Jake and Kaya's stay. The council voted to create the position of ambassador and to appoint Kaya Whitehorse to the role with a 5-year term. Marcus was confirmed as the next chief, to take office upon their father's death. It was not the outcome anyone had originally envisioned, but it was one that gave hope to all factions. Chief Whitehorse, in one of his final public appearances, blessed both decisions. He told the gathered Apache that his children had found a way forward that honored both tradition and progress. He spoke of his pride in all 3 of his children, each serving their people in their own way. Then he asked Jake to stand and approach. Jake struggled to his feet and walked slowly to where the old chief sat. Daniel Whitehorse looked at him with tired but approving eyes. He told Jake that he had proven himself worthy of his daughter, that his courage and determination had been witnessed by all. He asked Jake to continue protecting and supporting Kaya in her new role, and Jake gave his word that he would. 3 days later, Chief Daniel Whitehorse died peacefully, surrounded by his family. His funeral was held with full honors, and both Marcus and Kaya spoke of their father's wisdom and guidance. The Apache mourned a great leader, but also celebrated the peaceful transition of power he had made possible. After the funeral, Jake and Kaya prepared to return to Mesa Colony. Jake's body had adapted somewhat to new Apache's gravity, but he knew he could not stay permanently without serious damage to his health. Kaya's role as ambassador would be based on Mesa Colony, where she could interact with frontier settlements while making regular trips to New Apache for diplomatic duties. On their last night on New Apache, they stood together looking up at the stars. Kaya thanked Jake for everything he had endured, for following her to this crushing world and standing beside her through the political trials. Jake told her that it had been worth it to see her find her place, to watch her become something more than just a warrior or a chief's daughter. She was an ambassador now, a bridge between worlds, exactly what she was meant to be. The journey back to Mesa Colony felt like returning home in a way their first arrival there had not. When they landed and Jake felt the blessed relief of normal gravity, he nearly wept with gratitude. Kaya helped him out of the exoskeleton, and they made their way back to their expanded cabin, which had been maintained by neighbors during their absence. Over the following months, they settled into their new life. Kaya's role as ambassador kept her busy, traveling to various settlements to meet with colonial leaders and back to New Apache for high-level